They said the dog feared no one because it had forgotten what kindness felt like, and by sunset, the entire mansion would realize that the only person brave enough to step toward the beast was the woman everyone else believed would never survive her first week. The morning air carried the scent of fresh-cut hedges and polished stone as Naomi Carter hurried across the courtyard of the Castellano estate, her worn black housekeeping shoes slipping slightly on the dew that clung to the marble path. She tightened her grip on the bucket of cleaning supplies before another accident could happen. It was only her fourth day working at one of the most guarded private estates outside Chicago, yet she had already earned an unfortunate reputation among the household staff. She apologized too much, walked a little too fast when she was nervous, and somehow always managed to bump into furniture that everyone else avoided with effortless grace. Earlier that morning, she had nearly dropped a silver serving tray worth more than her old car, drawing a chorus of sighs from the senior housekeepers. Nobody had shouted at her. They simply exchanged disappointed glances, the kind that quietly reminded someone they did not belong. Naomi understood those looks better than anyone. She had lived with them her entire life. Even so, she refused to let embarrassment harden her heart. She simply smiled, whispered another apology, and returned to work. At precisely 9 o'clock, the mansion fell into an unusual silence. Footsteps stopped. Conversations faded. Even the gardeners outside paused their work as a tall man in a charcoal suit crossed the central hallway with calm, measured steps. Vincent Castellano rarely needed to raise his voice. His presence alone seemed to rearrange the air around him. Employees instinctively straightened their backs as he passed, careful not to meet his eyes for longer than necessary. Naomi lowered her head respectfully, while continuing to dust an antique console table, hoping to disappear into the background. Then a deep, thunderous bark shattered the silence. The sound echoed through the estate like distant thunder rolling across a valley. Naomi flinched so suddenly that the feather duster slipped from her hand and landed softly on the polished floor. A few employees exchanged nervous glances before quickly looking away again. Everyone knew that bark. Everyone knew who it belonged to. Bruno. The massive German shepherd had become something of a legend inside the Castellano estate. New employees heard stories about him before they even received their uniforms. No one entered his private kennel unless specifically ordered. No one touched his food bowls. No one attempted to bathe him. Several professional handlers had quit after only a few days, not because Bruno had harmed them, but because they admitted they had never seen an animal carry so much fear behind such intimidating eyes. Vincent stopped walking without turning around. His calm voice drifted through the hallway. Bruno needs a bath today. Nobody answered. The silence became almost tangible. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes and realized every employee had suddenly found something fascinating to stare at somewhere else. One maid adjusted flowers that did not need arranging. A butler carefully folded an already perfect napkin. Even the groundskeeper standing outside pretended to inspect the fountain. Vincent waited another moment before speaking again, his tone unchanged. Who's willing to do it? The question lingered in the air with no reply. Naomi looked from one face to another, confused by the invisible wall of fear surrounding a task that sounded so ordinary. She thought about her mother recovering at home, the stack of unpaid medical bills hidden inside her apartment drawer, and the promise she had made before accepting this job. No matter how difficult things became, she would not lose another opportunity. Before she had time to reconsider, Naomi took one careful step forward, her voice quiet but unmistakably clear. "I can try, sir." Every pair of eyes followed Naomi as though she had just volunteered to walk into a thunderstorm carrying nothing but an umbrella with holes. Nobody tried to stop her because nobody believed words could change her mind once she had spoken them aloud. Vincent Castellano slowly turned toward her for the first time that morning. His expression remained unreadable, neither impressed nor concerned, as though he had spent years watching people make choices they did not fully understand. His steel blue eyes rested on Naomi for only a moment before shifting toward the estate manager. "Take her to the kennel," he said calmly. "If Bruno refuses, do not force him." Without another word, Vincent continued down the hallway, disappearing into his private office while the mansion gradually came back to life. The whispers began almost immediately. "She has no idea. She will be back in 5 minutes. If she comes back at all." Naomi pretended not to hear them. She had learned long ago that fear often sounded louder than truth. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, caught up with her before she reached the back corridor. The older woman lowered her voice and gently touched Naomi's arm. "Child, you can still say you changed your mind." Naomi offered a grateful smile. "Thank you, but I really cannot." Mrs. Henderson sighed softly. "Most people think Bruno is dangerous because of his size. That is not the real problem. He trusts no one. He has sent away every trainer money could hire. The last groomer packed his equipment and never returned." Naomi nodded without speaking. She appreciated the warning, yet something inside her refused to believe that fear alone defined any living creature. They walked across the enormous backyard where carefully trimmed hedges framed stone pathways leading toward a separate brick building tucked behind rows of towering oak trees. The kennel looked less like an animal shelter and more like a private guest house, complete with large windows, climate control, and its own fenced exercise yard. Yet despite its comfort, the place felt strangely lonely. Before unlocking the gate, the estate manager handed Naomi a neatly folded towel, a bottle of dog shampoo, and a brush with long wooden bristles. "Everything you need is inside," he said. "If he starts barking, simply step back. Nobody will blame you." Naomi thanked him quietly before accepting the supplies. As the others remained several yards behind the fence, she noticed none of them seemed willing to move any closer. Their nervous distance told her more than their stories ever could. She took a slow breath and pushed open the wooden gate. The yard was silent except for the gentle rustling of leaves overhead. Bruno was nowhere to be seen at first. Then she noticed movement beneath the shaded porch attached to the kennel. Two amber eyes watched her without blinking. The enormous German shepherd remained perfectly still, his thick black and tan coat blending into the shadows. Naomi resisted the urge to freeze. Instead, she lowered the bucket onto the ground and deliberately stepped back several feet. She remembered something her late grandfather had taught her years ago while rescuing abandoned dogs around their neighborhood. "Never introduce yourself by taking space," he used to say. "Earn the invitation." Naomi slowly sat on the grass, folding her legs beneath her as though she had all afternoon to spare. She placed the brush beside her, leaving the towel untouched. Then she simply waited. No commands, no whistles, no treats, no attempt to prove she was in control. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh earth across the yard. Somewhere behind her, she could feel anxious eyes watching every movement through the fence. Minutes passed without a sound. Bruno continued studying her from the darkness, while Naomi quietly looked toward the flowering trees instead of directly into his eyes. She wanted him to understand one simple thing before anything else happened. She had not come to conquer him. She had only come to meet him. Bruno remained beneath the wooden porch long enough for the silence itself to become a conversation. Naomi could hear little more than the breeze moving through the oak branches and the distant splash of the courtyard fountain. She kept her hands resting loosely on her knees, resisting every instinct to rush the moment. Time had taught her that frightened hearts, whether human or animal, moved at their own pace. After several quiet minutes, the German shepherd shifted slightly. One large paw emerged from the shadows, followed by another. His movements were cautious rather than threatening, measured as though every step required a difficult decision. Naomi smiled softly without looking directly into his eyes. "You do not have to trust me today," she whispered. "You only have to know I am not here to make your day harder." Bruno tilted his head almost imperceptibly. The deep lines around his eyes made him look older than she expected, and for the first time she noticed that beneath his powerful frame was an unmistakable weariness. This was not the posture of an animal eager to frighten the world. It was the posture of one preparing to protect itself before disappointment arrived again. Several more moments slipped away before Bruno slowly closed the distance between them. Every employee watching from beyond the fence unconsciously held their breath. Mrs. Henderson quietly clasped her hands together while the estate manager instinctively reached toward the gate, prepared to intervene if necessary. Yet nothing happened except another small step. Then another. Bruno stopped only a few feet from Naomi. His ears remained alert, but his breathing had become steady. Naomi extended neither her hand nor the brush. Instead, she gently slid the bucket of warm water several inches farther away, making sure it could not appear threatening. Bruno lowered his nose toward the grass, taking in the unfamiliar scent surrounding the young woman. Soap, lavender, fresh cotton, a faint trace of lemon from the cleaning supplies she carried every morning. Beneath it all lingered something else that no bottle could contain. Patience. Bruno took one careful step closer and quietly sniffed the sleeve of Naomi's housekeeping uniform before lifting his head again. Naomi laughed softly, the warm sound surprising even herself. "I know," she said almost playfully. "I probably smell like every floor in this house." A few nervous smiles appeared among the employees watching from a distance. The impossible scene unfolding before them did not match the stories they had repeated for years. Inside the mansion, Vincent Castellano had just finished reviewing financial reports when one of the security monitors caught his attention. Every corner of the estate appeared on a wall of silent screens inside his private office, including the kennel yard. He paused with one hand resting on a folder and looked more closely. The camera showed Naomi sitting calmly in the grass, while Bruno stood beside her without a trace of agitation. Vincent frowned almost imperceptibly. He had seen experts arrive carrying expensive equipment, confident speeches, and years of experience. None of them had accomplished what this quiet housekeeper had done simply by sitting still. Without taking his eyes from the screen, Vincent slowly closed the folder in front of him. Outside, Bruno lowered his massive head until it rested only inches from Naomi's shoulder. She noticed something then that nobody else could have seen from where they stood. One of his front paws barely touched the ground. Every few seconds, he subtly shifted his weight away from it before pretending nothing was wrong. Naomi's smile faded into gentle concern. She did not reach toward the paw immediately. Instead, she looked into Bruno's calm amber eyes and whispered almost to herself, "You are not refusing help. You are hiding pain." Naomi remained exactly where she was, allowing another quiet minute to pass before moving at all. She knew that trust, once broken, could never be borrowed. It had to be earned one patient moment at a time. Bruno watched every small motion she made. When she slowly reached into the side pocket of her apron, his ears lifted again, but instead of pulling out the brush or the shampoo, she unfolded a clean white hand towel and placed it gently on the grass beside her. "Nothing scary," she said with a warm smile. "Just something clean." Her voice carried the same calm rhythm that had comforted frightened shelter dogs years before, and somehow Bruno seemed to recognize that rhythm more than the words themselves. He lowered his head once more, and this time he carefully rested his injured paw slightly farther forward. Naomi did not touch it immediately. Instead, she studied the way he shifted his weight, noticing that every movement favored the same leg. There was no anger in his posture. There was only quiet endurance. She slowly leaned forward until she was close enough to examine the paw without invading his space. Hidden between the thick pads was a tiny sliver of glass reflecting the afternoon sunlight. It was no larger than a fingernail clipping, yet every step Bruno had taken over the past several days must have reminded him it was there. Naomi's eyes softened. "Oh, buddy," she whispered. "No wonder you stopped trusting everyone." Beyond the fence, the employees could not see what she had discovered, only that she had moved closer than anyone had dared before. Mrs. Henderson pressed one hand against her chest while the estate manager stared without blinking. Inside his office, Vincent leaned toward the security monitor. The camera angle did not reveal the small piece of glass either, but it clearly showed Naomi speaking to Bruno as though he were an old friend instead of an animal everyone feared. Vincent reached for the remote and enlarged the image across the center screen. The meeting waiting on his desk no longer seemed important. Outside, Naomi slowly looked into Bruno's amber eyes. "I need to help your paw," she said gently. "If you do not want me to, I will stop." The German shepherd remained perfectly still. His breathing stayed calm. Carefully, Naomi held out the folded towel, allowing Bruno to smell it first. After a few seconds, he nudged the fabric with his nose before quietly lowering himself onto the grass. A collective gasp escaped from the staff watching through the fence. No command had been spoken. No leash had been tightened. Bruno had chosen the moment himself. Naomi smiled with quiet gratitude rather than celebration. She wrapped the towel loosely beneath his paw, shielding it from the bright sunlight, while gently brushing away loose dirt with her fingertips. Her movements were slow enough that Bruno could pull away whenever he wished, but he never did. When the tiny sliver finally became visible, Naomi carefully eased it free with nothing more than the corner of the towel in her steady hands. She immediately folded the towel over it, instead of holding it up for anyone to see. Bruno blinked several times before placing his paw fully on the grass for what appeared to be the first comfortable step in days. He looked at Naomi, then unexpectedly rested the side of his head against her shoulder with a long, peaceful sigh that seemed to release far more than physical discomfort. Watching from the monitor, Vincent sat in complete silence. He had spent years believing Bruno had become impossible to reach, yet a housekeeper everyone dismissed as clumsy had noticed in less than half an hour what no specialist, trainer, or employee had ever taken the time to see. At that moment, Vincent realized Naomi had not changed the dog. She had simply found the pain everyone else had overlooked. Bruno remained beside Naomi as though the invisible wall between them had quietly disappeared. He tested his front paw once, then again, placing more weight on it with each careful step until his movements became smooth and natural. Naomi laughed softly, relieved to see the tension leave his body. "That looks much better," she whispered. "I knew something small had been making your whole world feel heavy." The German shepherd answered with a gentle wag of his thick tail, the first anyone outside the kennel could remember seeing in months. Beyond the fence, the employees exchanged bewildered looks. Some had worked on the estate for years, yet none had witnessed Bruno standing so peacefully beside another person. Mrs. Henderson dabbed the corner of one eye with her handkerchief before quickly pretending she had only brushed away dust. Even the estate manager forgot the clipboard tucked beneath his arm as he watched the remarkable scene unfold. Inside the mansion, Vincent remained motionless before the wall of security monitors. The financial reports on his desk sat untouched while his coffee had long since grown cold. He replayed the previous several minutes from another camera angle, searching for the moment he believed he must have missed. There was no trick, no hidden command, no special training equipment. Naomi had done nothing extraordinary except notice what everyone else had ignored. Back in the yard, Naomi slowly reached for the wooden brush she had left untouched on the grass. Instead of immediately lifting it toward Bruno, she rested it across her lap so he could examine it first. Bruno leaned forward, sniffed the polished handle, then calmly looked back at her with quiet curiosity. "Thank you," Naomi said. "That tells me you are ready." She gently brushed one section of his thick coat using slow, even strokes. Loose fur drifted through the afternoon sunlight like tiny feathers carried by the breeze. Bruno closed his eyes for a brief moment, his breathing growing deeper with every careful motion. Naomi could not help smiling. Beneath the dust and tangled undercoat was a magnificent animal who had clearly once loved being cared for. She continued brushing patiently, speaking in the same calm voice she had used since entering the yard. "Everybody keeps saying you are difficult," she murmured, "but I think you were simply waiting for someone to stop rushing you." Bruno responded by leaning slightly against her shoulder, making no effort to move away as the brush glided across his back and neck. His ears relaxed. His tail rested comfortably against the grass. The enormous dog looked less like a feared guardian and more like a loyal companion finally allowed to rest. Naomi filled the bucket with fresh warm water from the outdoor faucet, testing the temperature with her fingertips before carrying it back. She dipped a soft cloth into the water and gently squeezed it over Bruno's shoulders. He barely reacted except to glance at her with quiet trust. "See," she whispered with a cheerful smile. "Nothing scary." Little by little, warm water and gentle soap worked through his thick coat. Foam gathered around the brush as Naomi carefully cleaned away weeks of dust, dried leaves, and loose fur. She never hurried, never pulled, and never forced him to stand in one place longer than he wished. If Bruno stepped aside, she simply waited until he chose to return. The employees beyond the fence watched in complete silence as the impossible slowly became ordinary. The dog everyone believed could never be groomed peacefully now stood beneath the afternoon sun, eyes half closed, enjoying every careful touch. Inside his office, Vincent slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the window overlooking the distant kennel. Although the trees partially blocked his view, he no longer needed the cameras to understand what was happening. For the first time in years, Bruno was not being managed. He was being understood, and Vincent felt a quiet question settle deep within his own heart. If one patient stranger could restore peace to the companion he had nearly given up on, what else in his own carefully guarded life had he mistaken for strength when it had really been loneliness all along? The last traces of soap disappeared beneath streams of warm water, revealing a coat that shimmered with healthy shades of black and deep brown beneath the afternoon sun. Bruno gave himself one gentle shake, sending tiny droplets sparkling through the air like scattered crystals before looking back at Naomi with unmistakable contentment. Instead of retreating into the shelter beneath the porch as everyone expected, he quietly walked to her side and lowered himself onto the grass until his broad head rested comfortably across her lap. Naomi could not help laughing. "I think that means we are finished," she said softly as her fingers absent-mindedly stroked the thick fur behind his ears. The enormous German shepherd closed his eyes and released a slow, peaceful sigh that carried across the silent yard. Nobody beyond the fence dared interrupt the moment. The estate employees stood frozen as though afraid even the smallest sound might break whatever quiet miracle had unfolded before them. One of the younger gardeners whispered, "I have worked here for 3 years, and I have never seen him sleep around anyone." Mrs. Henderson nodded without taking her eyes off Bruno. "He finally feels safe." Those 4 simple words lingered in the air. Inside the mansion, Vincent remained standing beside the window. He could no longer hear the conversations outside, but the picture before him spoke clearly enough. Bruno was asleep, truly asleep, not merely resting with one eye open as he usually did, but completely relaxed beside a woman he had met less than an hour earlier. Vincent slowly looked toward an old framed photograph resting on the bookshelf behind his desk. It showed a much younger Bruno as a playful puppy standing beside Vincent's late father, Anthony Castellano. They had both worn the same joyful expression. Vincent remembered afternoons when Bruno chased tennis balls across wide fields, greeted every visitor with innocent excitement, and refused to leave Anthony's side during long evenings on the porch. After his father's passing, everything had changed. Bruno stopped playing. He stopped trusting strangers. Eventually, he stopped trusting almost everyone. Trainers insisted the dog had become impossible. Veterinarians suggested stronger restraints during grooming. Specialists recommended expensive behavioral programs. Vincent had approved every attempt because he believed solutions could always be purchased if one searched long enough. Yet sitting only a few hundred yards away, Naomi had quietly accomplished what years of professional expertise had not. She had never tried to fix Bruno. She had simply listened to what silence had been saying all along. Outside, Naomi carefully reached for a fresh towel and began drying Bruno's coat with slow circular motions. The German shepherd barely stirred, only opening one eye briefly before deciding there was nothing worth worrying about. "You have been carrying so much all by yourself," Naomi whispered. "You deserve a little peace too." As she gently dried the fur around his neck, she noticed an old leather collar hidden beneath the thick coat. Unlike the expensive custom collar Bruno usually wore around visitors, this one looked faded with age. A small silver tag hung from it, polished smooth by years of use. Naomi carefully turned it over without removing the collar. On one side was Bruno's name. On the other, engraved in delicate lettering almost worn away by time, were the words, "Always come home." Naomi smiled sadly. "Someone loved you very much." Bruno opened his eyes and looked directly at her, his tail giving one slow sweep across the grass. At that exact moment, Vincent quietly entered the kennel yard through the side gate. His polished shoes made almost no sound against the stone path, yet every employee immediately straightened upon seeing him. Naomi, focused on finishing the towel drying, had not noticed he was there. Vincent stopped several feet away and watched Bruno remain peacefully beside her without the slightest sign of tension. For the first time in many years, the powerful man felt like an outsider looking in on something gentle that money, authority, and influence had never been able to create. Naomi looked up only when Bruno gently lifted his head from her lap and calmly walked toward the man standing several feet away. Every employee instinctively held their breath. Vincent Castellano remained perfectly still, his hands resting loosely at his sides as the German shepherd approached. For a brief moment, Bruno stopped between them, glanced back at Naomi, then quietly returned to stand beside her instead. There was no hesitation in the dog's choice. It was simple, peaceful, and completely honest. An almost invisible smile touched the corner of Vincent's mouth before disappearing as quickly as it had come. "You finished the impossible," he said in his calm, measured voice. Naomi immediately stood, carefully folding the towel over one arm. "I only gave him a bath, sir." Vincent looked toward Bruno, whose freshly cleaned coat gleamed beneath the afternoon light. "No," he replied quietly. "Many people have tried to do that. None of them succeeded." Naomi lowered her eyes with the same humility she had carried since arriving at the estate. "I do not think he was refusing a bath." Vincent studied her expression with genuine curiosity. "Then what was he refusing?" Naomi glanced toward Bruno before answering. "Being treated like a problem instead of someone who was hurting." Silence settled over the yard once again. The words were spoken without judgment, almost as though she were describing the weather, yet they landed with unexpected weight. Vincent looked toward Bruno, remembering years of expensive trainers, endless instructions, carefully designed routines, and every failed attempt to restore the loyal companion his father had once known. None of them had asked why Bruno had changed. They had only tried to change him back. Naomi gently rubbed the edge of the folded towel between her fingers before speaking again. "Pain changes behavior. Fear changes behavior too. But kindness gives both of them room to breathe." Vincent did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly walked toward Bruno, who remained relaxed beside Naomi without showing the slightest trace of uneasiness. The powerful man reached down and rested one hand on the dog's head. Bruno accepted the touch calmly, then looked back toward Naomi as though inviting Vincent into the quiet trust she had already earned. Vincent released a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding. "My father raised him," he said softly, almost speaking to himself. "After my father passed away, Bruno stopped recognizing the world the way he once did." Naomi listened without interruption. She understood that some stories required silence more than sympathy. Vincent's eyes drifted toward the old leather collar around Bruno's neck. "That collar was my father's. I have never been able to replace it." Naomi smiled gently. "You should not replace it." Vincent looked at her. "Why not?" "Because sometimes healing is not about forgetting where love began. Sometimes it is about helping someone feel safe enough to carry those memories without fear." The breeze stirred the oak branches overhead, scattering tiny patches of sunlight across the grass. None of the employees dared speak. They had worked beside Vincent for years, yet few had ever heard him remain in a conversation this long with someone he had met only days earlier. Bruno quietly sat between them, looking from one face to the other before resting comfortably at Naomi's feet once again. Vincent finally nodded, his expression softer than anyone in the yard could remember seeing. "You understand him better than every specialist I have hired." Naomi shook her head with a modest smile. "No, sir. I only slowed down long enough to let him tell me what he needed." Vincent's gaze lingered on her for another thoughtful moment. For the first time in many years, someone had reminded him that leadership was not always measured by the ability to command. Sometimes it was measured by the willingness to listen before asking to be followed. And standing in the quiet afternoon beside the dog his father had loved most, he realized that lesson had come from the one employee everyone else had underestimated. The quiet that settled over the kennel followed Vincent all the way back to the main house. He did not return to the reports waiting on his desk, nor did he resume the meetings carefully arranged for the afternoon. Instead, he stood beside the tall windows overlooking the estate, watching Naomi from a distance as she carefully cleaned the grooming tools before placing every brush and towel exactly where she had found them. There was no expectation in her movements, no glance toward the mansion hoping someone had noticed what she had accomplished. She simply finished her work with the same care she had shown while helping Bruno. That, more than anything else, unsettled Vincent. Most people wanted recognition. Naomi seemed content simply knowing the dog was comfortable again. Mr. Castellano, his chief of staff, Daniel Brooks, quietly entered the office carrying a leather folder. "The board members have arrived." Vincent did not look away from the window. "Reschedule them." Daniel hesitated, surprised by the unexpected answer. "This afternoon?" "Tomorrow." Daniel nodded respectfully before turning to leave. "One more thing," Vincent said. "Bring me Naomi Carter's employment file." Less than 10 minutes later, the slim folder rested on Vincent's desk. He expected very little from someone who had described herself as simply needing honest work. Yet as he slowly read each page, The picture became far more interesting than he imagined. Naomi had never worked in luxury estates before arriving at the Castellano mansion. Most of her previous jobs involved community organizations, animal shelters, and small family businesses. The wages had been modest, the positions temporary, yet every recommendation sounded remarkably similar. Patient, dependable, gentle under pressure. One handwritten letter from the director of a neighborhood rescue center caught Vincent's attention. Naomi volunteered every Saturday for nearly 4 years without accepting a single dollar. She had a rare ability to calm frightened animals that no one else could approach. More importantly, she treated every person who walked through our doors with the same dignity she offered the animals. If kindness could become a profession, she would be its finest example. Vincent quietly lowered the letter onto his desk. Nobody had mentioned awards, achievements, or impressive titles. Every reference described character instead of talent. He leaned back in his chair, remembering the way Naomi had spoken to Bruno without demanding anything in return. She had never asked the dog to prove himself worthy of compassion. She had offered compassion first. Outside, Naomi finished returning the supplies before walking toward the employee entrance carrying the now empty bucket. Along the way, she noticed one of the younger groundskeepers struggling to lift several heavy flour containers onto a small utility cart. Without saying a word, she quietly set down her own bucket and helped him finish the task. The young man thanked her with an embarrassed smile. Naomi simply wished him a pleasant afternoon before continuing toward the laundry room. She never realized Vincent had watched that small exchange from the second floor. He noticed she behaved exactly the same way when nobody believed they were being observed. That consistency impressed him more than dramatic gestures ever could. Later that evening, as the golden light faded across the estate, Bruno wandered out of his kennel without encouragement and walked directly to the back patio outside Vincent's study. Instead of waiting beside the familiar stone steps, he looked toward the service entrance where the household staff finished their shifts. Every few moments his ears lifted with quiet expectation. Vincent stepped outside carrying a cup of coffee and followed the direction of Bruno's gaze. A faint smile appeared on his face as understanding settled in. The loyal companion who had spent years avoiding nearly everyone was waiting for one person, and for reasons Vincent could not fully explain, he found himself hoping she would return the next morning just as much as Bruno did. The next morning the estate woke beneath a pale golden sunrise, but the atmosphere felt different long before anyone spoke about it. Employees noticed Bruno waiting quietly near the service entrance instead of pacing alone inside his private yard. The moment Naomi Carter stepped through the gate carrying her familiar cleaning supplies, the German shepherd rose immediately and walked toward her with calm confidence, his tail moving in slow, happy sweeps that drew astonished smiles from everyone nearby. Naomi laughed as she scratched gently behind his ears. "Good morning to you too," she whispered. Bruno rested his head against her shoulder for only a moment before proudly walking beside her toward the mansion as though he had already decided she belonged there. Word spread through the estate faster than the morning coffee. By 8 o'clock, every employee had heard the same unbelievable story. Bruno had chosen someone. Shortly afterward, Mrs. Henderson approached Naomi with an uncertain expression. Mr. Castellano would like everyone in the main hall. Naomi's stomach tightened. She quietly smoothed the wrinkles from her housekeeping uniform, wondering if she had unknowingly broken another rule. The grand hall slowly filled with housekeepers, gardeners, drivers, chefs, security personnel, and administrative staff, all standing beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected warm light across polished marble floors. Vincent Castellano entered without ceremony, his composed expression giving away nothing. Bruno walked directly beside him until reaching Naomi, where he calmly sat at her feet instead. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Vincent looked around at every employee before speaking in his measured voice. "Yesterday, all of you witnessed something important." Nobody interrupted. For years we believed Bruno had become impossible to reach. We hired experts, created procedures, and searched for expensive solutions. Yet the answer was never found in authority. He turned toward Naomi, who stood quietly with lowered eyes, visibly uncomfortable with so much attention. It was found in patience. Vincent paused before continuing. "Miss Carter reminded me that loyalty cannot be demanded. Trust cannot be purchased. Respect cannot be forced. They are given freely when someone feels safe enough to offer them. The room remained completely silent. Vincent stepped closer until he stood directly before Naomi. You accepted a responsibility that everyone else feared. You did not succeed because you were fearless. You succeeded because you chose compassion before control. Naomi looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Thank you, sir, she answered softly. Vincent slowly shook his head. No, it is I who should thank you. Several employees exchanged astonished glances. Very few had ever heard those words spoken by the man standing before them. Vincent continued. Effective immediately, Naomi Carter is no longer assigned to general housekeeping duties. From today forward, she will oversee Bruno's daily care and serve as my personal household assistant. Her salary, benefits, and accommodations will be adjusted accordingly. Naomi blinked in disbelief. Sir, I do not know what to say. Vincent allowed himself the smallest genuine smile. Then say yes. A quiet laugh spread through the room, gently dissolving the tension that had filled the hall only moments earlier. Naomi nodded, emotion shining in her eyes. Yes, sir. Thank you. Bruno responded as though he understood every word, gently pressing against her side while the staff smiled at the remarkable sight. Vincent looked once more at the loyal companion his father had loved, and then back at the young woman who had restored something he believed had been lost forever. Bruno made his choice before I made mine, he said calmly. He trusted the right person. I intend to do the same. As sunlight poured through the towering windows, bathing the hall in warm gold, the contrast between power and humility quietly disappeared. In the end, it was never the strongest voice that transformed the mansion, nor the wealth that filled its rooms. It was the quiet courage of one gentle heart willing to understand before judging. And on that ordinary morning, everyone present witnessed a truth they would never forget. Sometimes the greatest act of leadership begins with the simple decision to be kind.